Welcome all of you to our presentation today. This is ISO 9001-2015, knowing what to expect to ensure a stress-free audit. My name is Joseph Krolikowski. I am the QMS Program Manager for PJR. A couple of notes for our participants today. All of you are on mute, but we absolutely want to address your questions, so please utilize the question portion of the dashboard. There is a section titled Questions. We will address your questions at the end of the presentation. Now, one of the more common questions that we get is whether or not this presentation will be available after we're finished. We do make our presentations available in two ways. Firstly, if you want to get a copy of the slides, those will be available for download shortly after we're finished from our website. And if you'd like to rewatch this webinar with the voiceover, we do post all of our webinars to our YouTube page, and you can find the link for that again on our website. Just look for the heading Previously Recorded Webinars. We're going to unpack this topic in a couple of steps today. We're going to begin with some opening comments on what ISO 9001 is all about, how it's an interpretive document. We'll go over how the content of this presentation was put together. We will examine then 5 key areas. I've got them listed on screen here. We'll cover a couple of other areas that were not directly tied to the data sampling. We're going to review the leadership interview, which is kind of a central tenet of our audit process. Just a couple of quick concluding remarks and then your questions. So let's begin by acknowledging a key aspect of what ISO 9001 is, and that is it is an interpretive document. Now, you may not know this. When the 2015 revision of ISO 9001 was published, this was actually the 5th edition, for those of you that were keeping count. It was the first version of ISO 9001 to have an explanatory appendix, Appendix A. Now, it has since become one of the only ISO published standards to have a separate supplemental standard for explanatory purposes. And that standard is ISO TS 9002. TS stands for Technical Specification. Now, this document was published about a year after ISO 9001 was published on November 1st, 2016. We'll be referring to it as ISO 9002 in a couple of places in our presentation today. Now, its full title is Quality Management Systems Guidelines for the Application of ISO 9001-2015. So what this document is, it is sanctioned guidance that gives you clause-by-clause ideas on fulfilling all the different requirements from ISO 9001. Now, if we've got anybody on the call today that remembers the old version of ISO 9004, the 2000 edition, this 9002 publication is similar in style and content to that document. So, with it being acknowledged that this is an interpretive document, it therefore is logical for us to acknowledge that none of the requirements from ISO 9001 has a perfect method for implementation. Every individual organization has to decide for itself what it means to fulfill all of the different requirements that ISO 9001 has within it. Now, the auditor's role is to review what the organization has done and exercise some judgment as to whether or not that methodology represents a true fulfillment of the requirement. Now, one of the more interesting things that changed when the 2015 revision of ISO 9001 was published was it actually eliminated the last of the required procedures. If you go back to the first and second edition, There were 16 mandatory procedures within ISO 9001. Now that was stripped down to 6 in the 3rd and 4th edition. And now in the 5th edition, they've removed all of the procedural requirements. So again, they want to be very open and very accepting, I suppose, of the fact that there are different ways to control an activity, different ways to control a process. Now, most of our clients still choose to have procedures for various activities and aspects of what they do. But understand that just because ISO doesn't require procedures anymore, that does not mean that your procedures are no longer subject to audit. In other words, if you choose to have a procedure, that's fine, but you're going to be held accountable for what you've written into that procedure. And that's due in part to the definition that we have for the term audit criteria. Now, that's a term that comes from the ISO 9000 document. That's the fundamentals and vocabulary document. So audit criteria is defined as a set of policies, procedures, or requirements, very inclusive, used as a reference against which the objective evidence is compared. So in other words, when you're going through an ISO 9001 audit, it isn't exclusively ISO 9001 that you're held accountable to. That's the key point of this slide. Now, ISO 9001 2015 at this point, looks like I have to update this slide. This is its 8th year of publication. We're not quite to 8 years yet. It was published in September of that year, but it has quite a tenure now. ISO 9001 itself has been around for 30 plus years. Now, despite that, despite the fact that we've had this standard for all this time, it seems that the same things keep coming up in the ISO 9001 audits year after year, the same stumbling points. So what we did to put this presentation together, we did a data mining exercise. We pulled 350 audits from a period of time covering roughly October 2017 to October 2018. Now, I'll mention that we have had ongoing feedback on this since the data mining exercise was performed, and the results are unchanged. These are still the most common areas where nonconformances were being written. This is definitely a top 5 list, and this is still applicable today in 2023. The #1 issue cited, management review meetings, followed by internal audits, quality objectives, calibration issues, and external provider or supplier approvals. Now, what I find interesting from this list is that 3 of these requirements, management review, internal audit, and calibration, these are all legacy requirements. In other words, these are requirements that have been part of ISO 9001 going all the way back to the beginning in 1987. So the consultants, the auditors, the folks that have been involved from day one, they've been writing these findings all along. So again, recognizing that we can't advocate specific requirements or specific methodologies, rather, to fulfill any of these requirements. What we can do at PJR is we can try to provide some clarity on what these various requirements are commonly interpreted to mean and how they are commonly fulfilled. So over the next few slides, what we're going to be doing is going over what we've learned, what we've seen, what we accept. Now, this is not an official endorsement. This is not to be used as any justification for any sort of nonconformance. Now, if you have a situation where you need to file a dispute, we'll be going over disputes a little bit later in the presentation as well. So stay tuned for that also. So let's unpack the first requirement most often cited, #1, and that is management review. Management review is found in section 9.3, and it is made up of 3 subclauses, which we will refer to as parts. In part 1, it indicates that the management reviews need to be conducted at planned intervals. That's kind of the key portion of that first paragraph. Basically, an organization needs to have some manner of controlling the frequency and the content of the management review meeting process. Now, what those controls are going to be, it's going to vary from place to place. You know, some organizations, they'll have internal schedules. Some organizations will have a procedure for this particular activity. Others will use automated reminders, and some may use all 3. But the key is that you demonstrate that the management review process is being conducted in a planned fashion at planned intervals. In part 2, we unpack the input requirements. In other words, these are the things that you are required to discuss within the management review process. And as you can see, it's a fairly extensive list. There's a lot of items that are covered here: customer satisfaction, nonconformities, audit results, etc. Each of those content items is mandatory, but very importantly, it is not a requirement that every single one of those items has to be included in every single management review meeting. You can definitely do this in small bites if you're so inclined. If you're having a meeting every month or every week or whatever is sensible for you, you can definitely take it in smaller bites. Now, some of our clients, smaller organizations especially, they find that it works best for them to have the management review meeting once a year or once every 6 months. That's also acceptable. We see often that organizations like to put the meeting together in a PowerPoint presentation. That's great, but it's not mandatory. Some organizations use a standardized agenda format to make sure that nothing is missed. Also great, also not mandatory. Again, the intent is that your meeting is going to cover all of these topics. How you get to that, how you ensure that that's done, entirely up to you. In the final clause under management review, we have a section on outputs. And I always like to emphasize this business of decisions and actions. As you can see, I've got that underlined. The management review meeting is supposed to be productive. It's supposed to lead to decisions and actions. It's not just a churn of information. This is not just, let's talk about these topics and that's the end of it. Our auditors, when they review your management review minutes, they are going to say, okay, these are the decisions that you indicated. These are the actions that you said you were going to take. Let's follow up on that. Let's follow the audit trail and verify, okay, did you do all of these things that you indicated you were going to? So again, management review must be productive. It must lead to decisions and actions, and you have to have records of the management review activity. That's where that phrase, retain documented information, comes into play. Okay, so let's move on to the number 2 most cited item, and that is internal audit under clause 9.2. Now, this requirement has 2 subclauses. Now, in the first part of the requirement, it talks about conducting internal audits at planned intervals. Again, there's that phrase, just like we had earlier on the management review requirement. And then you'll note that it says this, to assess the quality management system. Keep that phrase in mind, and ensuring that it meets various requirements, including the requirements of this international standard. When they say that, of course, they're referring to ISO 9001. So we already kind of mentioned about planned intervals. You have to have a means of managing the internal audit process, whether it is done through a schedule, a formal schedule, calendar triggers, issuance of audit plans, an internal audit database, what have you. All of these are perfectly acceptable. You just need to figure out what is going to work for you and for your organization. And again, this is not something that you need to do all in one step. If you feel that it is beneficial or helpful to do the internal audit in small bites, that's great. As long as you get to all of the processes and cover the full internal audit, then so much the better. Now, the reason I have the requirements of this international standard pointed out is that you do have to ensure that all of the requirements are included, and that includes the internal audit itself. So yes, you really are required to perform an audit of the audit. There are times where we see an organization will have an internal audit, but only some of their processes have been looked at. And then when we inquire, what about the rest of it? They don't really have anything to show us. So that's a common mistake. Now also, I noted that the audit has to be performed against the quality management system. Now, bear in mind that ISO 9001 itself says that a quality management system is made up of processes. So therefore, it is expected that you will structure your internal audits with respect to your processes. And not necessarily the clauses of ISO 9001 itself. This needs to be a process-driven internal audit activity. That's the expectation. Now, in the second part of the requirement, we have that you need to carry out the internal audits according to an audit program. You need to define criteria and scope. And then we hit a very important clause about auditor objectivity, where it states that auditors need to be impartial of the audit process. You'll note also they talk about ensuring both correction and corrective action. We'll unpack that in a second. And then we have another retained documented information statement. Now, the reason I point out competency is you'll note none of what we looked at specifies anything in particular for what it means to be a competent internal auditor. I get this question all the time. What do we have to do to make our internal auditors qualified? Well, the short version is it's up to you. It's another task within your system, and therefore you have to define competency requirements, and that comes from section 7.2. So you have to do something, and your auditors have to be qualified and competent, but what that something is, entirely up to you and your organization. That's a very key point that some folks do not fully understand. Now, another issue that comes up frequently is a lack of responsiveness to the internal audit nonconformances. Now, understand that your internal audit nonconformances need to be treated with the same seriousness that you take with a nonconformance from PJR or with a customer complaint. The requirement, as we looked at, it does mention both correction and corrective action. And finally, you do have to keep records of your internal audits. And there needs to be, again, enough records to substantiate that you did an internal audit of all the processes. In other words, that you did a thorough internal audit. So not just nonconformances being written, but who did the internal auditor interview? What jobs did they look at? What were some of the things that they sampled? What were some of the jobs that they reviewed? These are all things that we need to see when we look at the internal audit record, kind of filling us with confidence that the internal audit touched on all the areas that it needed to. Now, I want to take a second here to talk a little bit about consultants, because we have a lot of clients that work with consultants, and in some cases, those consultants are doing the internal audits for their clients, which is perfectly fine. But you have to understand that it's still your system. It's still your internal audit program, even if your consultant is the one doing it for you. So in other words, you need to be able to speak confidently on how your internal audit process is controlled, how the internal audits are scheduled, how you go about responding to the nonconformances, etc. Always bear that in mind. It is your system. It's not your consultant's system. It is your system. And therefore, you need to be prepared to answer the auditor's questions. Okay, moving on to number 3, and that is quality objectives, found in section 6.2. And again, this is a 2-part requirement. So let's go ahead and unpack it. To begin with, it requires that you have quality objectives at relevant functions, levels, and processes. And then we have these 5 bullet points in terms of what the quality objectives have to be. And I want to highlight 3 of these: that they be measurable, that they be relevant to conformity of products and services and enhance customer satisfaction, and that they be monitored, communicated, and updated. So let's start with measurable. Now, the idea with this is if there is not an aspect of measurability, there's no reliable way to determine if the objective has been met. Now, there's a lot of ways you can measure things, right? You can talk about responses on a customer survey, or measures of scrap, or measures of on-time delivery, what have you. But the item has to be measured, something where you can definitively say we achieved the goal or we didn't achieve the goal. Now, I do want to mention that variable measurement type objectives are the most common. We will accept attribute type objectives. Something, for example, we're going to achieve NADCAP accreditation by such and so date. Well, that's something where it's kind of a pass-fail type item. Those are referred to as attribute, and those are completely acceptable. We will accept those as measures of a system's effectiveness also. Now, this business about the objectives having to be relevant to customer satisfaction and products and services. This was a new idea when ISO 9001 was published. Now, it's important to note that objectives that are rooted in things like profitability or safety, what have you, these are not forbidden, but if you have those types of objectives, you need to make sure that you have other objectives that are going to fulfill this aspect of relevancy to customer satisfaction and products and services. So that for you, that may mean that you're going to have more than a few quality objectives. Now, understand also that quality objectives are a topic that everyone in the audit is going to be expected to demonstrate some knowledge and awareness of. Now, how you accomplish that, again, entirely up to you. This could be placards, meetings, handing out little cards, whatever works for you, but it needs to be something, and it needs to be effective. I suppose you could say that about the entire standard. It needs to be something, and it needs to be effective. Now, the second part of the quality objectives requirements reads as follows. When you're planning on how to achieve your objectives, you need to determine what will be done. And then aspects like resources, responsibility, how it will be, when will it be completed, and how the results will be evaluated. For this business of what will be done, we turn to ISO 9002 for a bit of clarity. And it says that you need to determine the actions that need to be implemented to achieve the quality objectives. You need to figure out what your steps are going to be, how are you going to accomplish this? This is part of the process in putting together the quality objectives. Now, the overall takeaway from this is that it's not enough to simply have the objectives in the first place. You can't just say, these are our objectives and lots of luck. You have to track progress achieved towards them. You have to take necessary action to improve their performance if you're not quite making it. Now, that means an appropriate response. Doesn't necessarily mean formal corrective action. So when you're having discussions with your auditors about your quality objectives, it's going to be possible that you have one or two of them that you're not quite achieving. And when I audit those kinds of companies, we always have a dialogue. Okay, so you came up a little short on on-time delivery. What are you doing about it? And it does not necessarily have to be a formal corrective action. There's a lot of things that substantiate necessary action that meet that definition. Okay, let's move on to number 4, and that is monitoring and measuring resources. Now, a lot of folks refer to this requirement under the title calibration. It's a little bit of a misnomer, but I'll leave that part out of it. Monitoring and measuring resources, this is going to generally refer to any device or tool or gauge or meter or scale or what have you that is used to perform monitoring and measurement of outputs. Now, most of you probably refer to that as inspection and or testing. So this is going to be your CMMs, your calipers, your micrometers, your surface blocks, laser measurement devices, what have you, all of the different gauging within your system. This is also a 2 subclause requirement, and it's found in section 7.1.5. Now, in the first part, it talks about determining resources needed, gauges needed, in order to ensure valid, reliable results, making sure that these are suitable for the type of activities being undertaken, that they're fit for purpose, and then, key phrase, shall retain appropriate evidence of fitness for purpose of the monitoring and measurement resources. And that's our key focus on that first requirement. In other words, you have to have documented information for fitness for use. That's going to be the calibration records, the calibration or verification records for all of your measurement devices. Now, the content of those records, what's going to be written into those records, is influenced by the second part of the requirement. So let's actually jump ahead to part 2 here. So where your measurement traceability is a requirement, here's what the measuring equipment needs to show. It needs to be calibrated or verified at intervals or prior to use against measurement standards traceable to international or national measurement standards, and it needs to be identified in order to determine its status and safeguarded from adjustments, damage, or deterioration. Now, the key items here are the ones that I've highlighted: traceable to standards and identified. Let's unpack those two, because these are the two most oft violated aspects of the requirement. This business of national or international standards, let's start there. What this means is that it needs to be traceable to a nationally recognized standard. Now, here in the United States, that's going to be the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST. Now, NIST is it's a neat organization. They're based in Washington, D.C. They provide all of the, I guess you could call them the ultra mega masters in terms of this is the most precise measure of blank. And they provide them for all sorts of different things, for length, for weight, masters for light measurement, and all sorts of things, all the different measures you can think of. Now, there are circumstances, rare now, but there are circumstances where NIST does not have an official master for a particular type of measurement method. Where that is the case, Most often, what that's going to mean is that the calibration is going to be performed by the device manufacturer, by the manufacturer of that measurement device. The other part of this business of consistent and reliable device identification in order to determine status. The measurement devices need to be identified. Now, what that means is entirely up to you. A serial number is a form of identification. An engraved number is a form of identification. Calibration stickers are a form of identification, but they're not mandatory. And I think in some quarters, it's still assumed that calibration stickers are mandatory. They're not. As long as the device identification permits traceability to the calibration records, any approach taken is going to be acceptable. So your devices have to be identified and they have to be traceable to national measurement standards. Those are the two key takeaways from that clause. Okay, moving on to number 5, and that is external provider approvals. Now, I want to take just a quick second here and unpack this term external provider, because in the older versions of ISO 9001, this was not the term that was used. This is a term that is meant to cover a number of different types of outside companies. This could be straight suppliers, folks that you buy raw materials from. This could be subcontractors, folks that you are working with, say, for product finishing. Could be outside partner companies, what have you. Basically, think of external provider as someone that you are using for an aspect of your quality management system and the scope that makes it up. So in 8.4.1, we have the following requirements. Firstly, you have to determine and apply criteria for the evaluation, selection, monitoring of performance, and reevaluation of external providers. And then you have to retain documented information of these activities. Very key wording there. We're going to unpack that on the next slide. So first of all, it is up to you what it means for an external provider to be approved. And that can take a variety of shapes and sizes. It's up to you to figure out what the criteria is going to be. It can't just be nothing. It has to be some form of approval criteria. Also, note that it talks about not just initial evaluation, but monitoring and reevaluation. Also, very key. Note that it says retained documented information, records, of these evaluation activities, plural. What this means is if you have the external provider's name on an approved supplier list, that's not enough on its own. That doesn't constitute a record of the evaluation activity. That is an item that even today, and again, this requirement is over 30 years old at this point. This is still being violated in some audit situations. Okay, a couple of other areas that I want to unpack that are key. These are not necessarily areas where we see an abundance of nonconformances being written, but we definitely want to highlight them as key aspects of ISO 9001 because they were new. At the time that the standard was published, these were the two big new requirements. These are risk and interested parties. So let's start with risk. The term risk is actually used 16 times in the auditable portion of ISO 9001:2015. That means in sections 4 through 10, that term risk appears 16 times. Excuse me. So that means that it is not a standalone activity. Rather, it is something that touches on the system at large. This is very much the same kind of idea that we had when the 2000 version of ISO 9001 was published, and continual improvement was the new idea at that time. Now, understand that a formal risk management process is not specifically required. Now, most organizations that we've worked with, that's exactly what they do, but it's not mandatory. ISO 9002 talks about this in terms of key risks as being the failure of processes, products, and services to meet requirements, or the organization not achieving customer satisfaction. So what does the actual clause say? Well, the actual clause in this case is in 6.1, and it starts out with, when you're planning for your system, you need to consider the issues referred to in 4.1. This means both those that come from inside and outside the organization, and the requirements that are referred to in clause 4.2, and that's alluding to both internal and external interested parties. And determine from those inputs then the risks and opportunities that need to be addressed. To do what? Well, there's 4 things that are intended here. First, to give assurance that your system can achieve what it's intending to achieve. And then we have this kind of 2-part requirement here: to enhance desirable effects, which is opportunities, or reduce undesired effects, which is risks, and then overall to achieve improvement. In 6.1.2, it goes on and says that once you've determined what the risks and opportunities are, you need to take action to address those risks and opportunities and figure out how you are going to integrate those actions into the quality management system processes. Now, what do they mean by actions to address risks and opportunities? Well, again, we turn to ISO 9002 for some guidance. And ISO 9002 breaks this down into 5 pieces. They say, well, first of all, you can have risk avoidance. You can just stop doing whatever that particular item is and avoid the risk that way. Now, that may obviously not always be possible. You can limit the risk. You can do things like write procedures, have work instructions, train personnel, and therefore try to reduce the likelihood of that event occurring. You can share the risk. You can get into things like advanced bulk purchasing of raw materials, what have you, with your customers. You can transfer the risk. This gets into things like insurance or other similar arrangements. And once you've done all of the things that are reasonable to take care of the risk, you have what they refer to as risk acceptance. In other words, that you're accepting the final residual remaining risk as acceptable, as appropriate. Now, how do we audit this? How does PJR audit this risk activity? Well, what we've done is we've trained our auditors to ask about risk activity, risk actions. And we've trained them to be very open-minded in terms of what the clients are explaining, what they're showing. We expect you, our clients, to understand this concept and to be prepared to explain what your approach is. Now, bear in mind that in terms of documentation, there's really only one place in the whole standard that mandates records pertaining to risk actions, and that's management review, section 9.3. In 9.3.2e, it says that the effectiveness of actions taken to address risks and opportunities needs to be discussed within management review, and of course 9.3.3 says that we have to have records of management review. Let's unpack the other kind of new item or newish item at this point, and that's interested party. There's actually a definition for interested party. This is taken both from 9001 and from 9000, and that is a person or organization that can be affected by or perceive themselves to be affected by a decision or activity. Now, the most common examples that are referred to are found in Appendix A of ISO 9001. So this is going to include customers, obviously, ownership, if that is the case, the employees of the organization, their suppliers, and then it even touches on things like unions, partners, competitors, what have you. Now in 4.2, there's some interesting verbiage that's used. It says that the organization needs to determine who the interested parties are, but it emphasizes who are the interested parties that are relevant to the quality management system. And that's very key verbiage. So it is up to you who the relevant interested parties are. It's absolutely up to you. The terminology that's used even, it was intended to kind of broaden your mind, so to speak, in terms of who that might be and who might be having an influence on the quality management system. Now, one point that we want to emphasize is that it is most likely, it's not definitely, but it's most likely inappropriate for an organization to conclude that their only interested party group is their customer base. So we've trained our auditors that if an organization says the only interested party are the customers, we're going to inquire, well, okay, what was the process that you used to arrive at that conclusion? What kind of analysis did you do to come to that conclusion? And if we don't really see any evidence of a structured analysis having been done, it's possible that this was not appropriate, and again, possible that a nonconformance is warranted. So who else might be an interested party? Well, again, from 9002, we can look at an even longer list of potential candidates for interested party. We can talk about government organizations, trade associations, the parent companies, intellectual property owners, franchisors, etc. 9002 goes on to indicate the methods that are appropriate for figuring out what your interested parties want from you. And it talks about, for example, reviewing the orders that you're getting, looking at statutory regulatory requirements, participating in these types of associations, reviewing supply chain relationships, having customer surveys, etc. Obviously, this is going to vary from situation to situation, and it's going to be dependent on the type of industry that you work in, but whatever you're doing needs to be appropriate, needs to be effective. Now, there are possible nonconformances related to interested parties. I'll be very forthcoming with you and say that these are not super common. We don't see a lot of nonconformances in this area. But the two clauses that are in play are section 4.2, where if we have no evidence or limited evidence of a process for monitoring and reviewing information from interested parties, that could potentially be cited under 4.2. Also, in 9.3.2, subclause C1, it indicates that you need to monitor information on interested party feedback. And if we don't see that that's being discussed within management review, then potentially there'll be a nonconformance for that clause. So there's one more item that I want to go over with you, and that is the role of leadership. And this is a term that's actually used in the standard, and this is found in section 5.1. So this was kind of a new idea for us, and it was something that we had to take kind of a new approach in our audit to try to ensure that we were hitting these requirements in the intended fashion. So what we've done is we've created a special section of the audit report called the leadership interview. Now, those of you that have been through at least one PJR audit for ISO 9001 in the last couple of years, I'm sure your auditors have said to you, okay, let's have the leadership interview, perhaps even coming out of the opening meeting. This is something that they are directed to do by the audit report itself. Now, these are the actual leadership interview questions, As you can see, they touch on a couple of different areas. They talk about accountability of leadership, participation in the system, who are the interested parties, how are you monitoring interested party requirements, and what are the internal external issues that are going on. These are all items that are found primarily in sections 5.1, but also items here from section 4. Now, one item that I always like to mention when I talk about this leadership interview, we've trained our auditors to avoid interviewing just a single person for this. Now, obviously, if it's a small company, if it's 3 to 5 people, then okay, that makes it plausible that there's only a single person that's considered leadership. But especially if we're talking about anything more than that, if we're talking a 10-person operation, a 20-person operation, what have you, it's not just one person in leadership. At least that is what our experience has shown. So be prepared to have your team ready for this leadership interview. 9002 even talks about what does it mean for top management? What does this mean? It means that you can delegate your responsibilities, but accountability still remains with top management. So those of you that are with us today that are presidents or chief executive officers, what have you, you're still ultimately accountable and responsible for the effectiveness of the ISO 9001 system. Now, one of the more questions that we get occasionally is, well, what happens if we don't agree? If we have a nonconformance that we do not agree with? Well, we are required to provide a process for an impartial review of contested nonconformances. Now, in PJR's case, this is explained in a document called Pro-10, Procedure 10. If you want to get your hands on Procedure 10, it's available for download. If you go to our website, go to the very bottom of the page, you'll find a link titled Registration Document Download. And you can download a copy of Pro-10 for yourself. Now, per the Pro-10 stipulation, we have to receive your dispute, if you plan to file one, within 15 calendar days of the end of the audit. Now, I do want to mention, we have a whole separate webinar on this topic. It's called Your Ongoing Relationship with PJR. It covers a variety of items, but it's got a significant section of content expressly for explaining the disputes activity. In conclusion, ISO 9001 remains the world's most utilized management system standard. There are just over 900,000 registered companies worldwide. And many of the items that are cited in nonconformances are entirely avoidable. And unfortunately, they seem to come up time and again. We do hope that our presentation today has left you feeling more confident that things will go well on audit day. PJR also has a clause-by-clause primer course if you're ready for a deeper dive into ISO 9001. And you need to have a better understanding in preparation for your audit. Now, this is entitled ISO 9001-2015, a clause-by-clause analysis. Now, this course can be found on our website if you look for the link entitled Training. It is completely free, and it's a voiceover, and it goes through the entire standard, explaining the various clauses one at a time. We've had a lot of great feedback on this course, and again, it is 100% free. Anybody can take it. If you'd like to tune in for one of our other webinars, I have a few suggestions for you. Firstly, we have a special presentation on non-applicable clauses, getting your arms around what can and what cannot be excused in an audit assessment. It's a very key concept, especially if you're just getting your system set up. Also, I always highly recommend my presentation, The Interaction of Processes and Its Importance to a Successful Audit. This is an unpacking of the topic of processes and how to correctly understand them. Now, we do have a variety of webinars on a lot of other topics. We have presentations on stage 1 auditing, on corrective action, and on several of the standards that we certify. So we're always putting out webinars. Definitely feel free to join us for them. And just like this webinar, all of them 100% free. If you'd like to be kept informed of the latest news automatically, the best way for you to do that is to go to our website at pjr.com. If you go to the bottom of the page, you'll find a place you can input your email address and click subscribe. You will be opted in for automatic updates on things like new webinars, changes to the standard, and other helpful points of information. I do thank you for your time and attention to my presentation. I'm going to go ahead and unlock the question portion of the dashboard and see if we have any questions today. It looks like we do have a few. So I'm going to go ahead and answer these in the order they were received. Okay. As a reminder, if you want to get a copy of the presentation, we will make the slides available for download shortly after we're finished. And if you want to rewatch this webinar, it will be posted to our YouTube page. You'll just need to look for the link entitled Previously Recorded Webinars. Okay, so a question from Cole Rodriguez. What can we expect for the second phase of the audit after you have passed phase 1 with 0 nonconformities? Well, Cole, I'm going to assume that you're referring to the stage 1, stage 2 audit process. Stage 1 is a very brief sampling of your system. There's just a handful of things that are looked at, things like internal audit, management review, what have you. If you did well in stage 1, and it sounds like you did, stage 2 should go smoothly, but understand that stage 2 is going to look at the entire quality management system. So it's possible that there may be some nonconformances that you'll need to respond to. But all of the items that we've looked at today should be helpful in preparing for stage 2. Sarah King asks, would you please explain again what you mean by needing to include the internal audit process in the internal audit? I'm not sure how to do this. Well, Sarah, think of it this way. If you have a team that does an internal audit, they look at things like purchasing, sales, production, shipping, design and development, etc. All of those are requirements from ISO 9001, but internal audit is a requirement also. Somebody has to do an audit of the audit, and it can't be anyone that was a participant in the internal audit. So, you know, it's obviously it's going to be done after the internal audit is complete. It's going to be a review of the records that the internal auditors put together, etc. There's a lot of ways that you can go about doing that. But again, you do have to do an audit of the audit. That's the expectation. Naylet Pinero, I do hope I'm pronouncing that right. Can we have a few high level of objectives and then cascade them to the different teams? Absolutely. That's a very common strategy that we see where an organization will say that there are a few objectives where there are multiple contributing processes, and that's completely acceptable. It's even common. Pinero also asks, who can do the audit of the internal audit? Well, bear in mind that it's up to the organization what it means to be a qualified, competent internal auditor. So who can do it? It's entirely up to you and your organization. Tony Nath asks, why is it mandatory to monitor calibration environment? What is the acceptance criteria? Well, the intent behind the requirement, Tony, is that, and first of all, in terms of the environment, again, you'll understand that it is ultimately up to the organization to determine what is going to work for their circumstances in terms of fitness for use, fitness for purpose. So the methods that are used the techniques that are used, the environments that are used are going to be to a point at the organization's discretion. But it does have to translate to, is it going to provide valid measurement results? And that's obviously going to be driven by the criteria, the measurements, the specifications, how tight those specifications are, what have you. So there is no mandatory environment. It's a case of it's situationally dependent. I hope that helps. Jesse Allen asks, for quality objectives, is it necessary to yearly update the requirements of your objectives, or is that a completely internal organizational decision? Well, Jesse, in terms of setting what the objectives are, setting your goals and whatnot, think of it this way. The organization is required to determine what the objectives are, what the goals are, what have you. Now, how long those are the goals, to a point, it is up to you, but understand that it needs to drive improvement in the quality management system. These need to be relevant objectives. So I'm certainly not going to tell you that you have to update them every year. The ISO standard does not say that, doesn't even come close to saying that. But you need to be prepared to explain year over year, why are these still the relevant objectives for your company, for your quality management system? Tony Nath asks, does process monitoring gauging have to be included in the calibration program? Well, without a specific example, I'm going to say possibly. It's going to be dependent on what it's used for, and if it is used to confirm the outputs that are relevant to the scope of the system. So I can't say no definitively. I have to say possibly. Jesse Allen asks, how do you vet an internal auditor? Again, it is entirely up to the organization. Thermal Mystery asks, is there any checklist available to ensure we are well prepared in terms of documents and records for each of the clauses? Not from Perry Johnson registrars, Hermel, I'm afraid. Again, this is an interpretive standard. There's a lot of different ways that you can go about fulfilling these requirements. So you have to kind of figure out what works for you and for your company. And when we do our audit, we will validate whether or not these approaches taken were effective. Bear in mind that a nonconformance within an audit is not a death sentence. You'll always have a chance to respond and improve your system. And that appears to be the end of the questions. So appreciate your time today, appreciate the questions. Hope everyone has a great week. Thank you so much.